So if you're out walking in the woods and you start hearing a podcast, you'll know it's us.
And it's not the podcast in my ears. It's a wild podcast.
Welcome to the Streets.mn podcast, the show where we highlight how transportation and land use can make our communities better places. Coming to you from beautiful Seward, Minneapolis, Minnesota, I am your host, Ian R. Buck. It's often easy to think of wildlife as something that primarily exists outside of the cities, only occasionally visiting our urban spaces. But many species make their homes among us, often without humans really knowing that they are there. Producer Stina Neel connected with researchers at the University of Minnesota who have been studying populations of foxes and coyotes in the Twin Cities. Let's listen in on her conversation with them.
I'm James Forrester. I'm a professor at the University of Minnesota in the Fisheries, Wildlife, and Conservation Biology Department. And I've been here since 2010. And while most of my work has been in more rural areas, I studied moose up in the Arrowhead area and elk in Yellowstone, places like that. I've become increasingly interested in urban wildlife. And so a few years ago, one of my postdoc at the time, Nick McCann, was chatting with me about some ideas he had about a proposal to put in to study some urban wildlife. And after talking about a few different species, decided that coyotes and foxes would be really interesting to study in the Twin Cities metro area. So Nick wrote up this proposal, and I helped edit it, and we submitted it to LCCMR and ultimately were funded. And that's what brought Geoff onto the project in 2019. And and then that funding went over a period of 3 years, and then we've just submitted a revised proposal to kind of build off of those preliminary data, and find out more about these really curious urban carnivores.
Real quick, what's LCCMR?
That is the Legislative
Citizen Commission on Minnesota Resources.
You can always put it in the show notes. And then, Geoff, can you introduce yourself?
Yeah, so I'm Geoff Miller. I'm a PhD candidate in the Ecology, Evolution, and Behavior Department at the University of Minnesota. So I came in on the project in 2019 to kind of be the boots on the ground for this project. So actually getting out, locating these animals to study, setting out traps for them, and then actually collaring and then tracking these animals throughout the course of the project. And then the data that's generated from this tracking project will be used in my dissertation, and is being used in my dissertation. There's still a little writing left to go, but I'm making some headways.
Yeah, so let's get like a brief overview of the study. So it's red foxes, gray foxes, and coyotes.
The original project was that. We have, in the current iteration, we dialed it back just to be red foxes and coyotes, simply because, the gray foxes are hard to find. In the first study, I think we collared 2 of them. We have, by accident, essentially caught one this year, and we had an old collar that we put on it, but we're not actually targeting the gray foxes this year.
Yeah, they're just biologically much harder to get a bead on, so they have smaller territories than the other species of canids do. Yeah. So in an urban area where you have a lot of private land, you might not even know where these gray foxes are unless somebody tells you that, oh, we have a gray fox using our neighborhood. So it's a lot harder to kind of find them and study them.
I don't think I've ever seen a gray fox. I've seen coyotes, I've seen red foxes. I've never seen a gray fox.
Yeah, they're a little more elusive, so they're also much more active at night, so they're more strictly nocturnal than coyotes and foxes are.
And an semi-arboreal candid, which is kind of interesting. They can climb trees.
Oh! Yeah. Okay, so how many coyotes have participated and are participating right now?
Yeah, so for coyotes, in the first iteration of the project, we had 17 participants. We captured one that we actually let go without a collar, collected some basic data on him as well. But in this iteration we just started this past fall, we captured an additional 18 coyotes, so that brings our total participant pool up to 35 individuals. And then since we've collared them, one of those actually, either his mate or another pack mate chewed off his collar. So we're down to 17 current participants.
When that happens, when they lose a collar or it's chewed off, do you all find it or do they shut down its mystery?
Yeah, we usually find it. Sometimes it's a little more work than it should be. So we lose some. For example, a red fox we think died in a culvert, and we just couldn't get into the stormwater system and get that collar back. But the vast majority were able to actually get the collar back.
These collars have a sensor on them, and so if they remain without moving for a period of time, I think it might be 8 hours. They have little accelerometers in them. They send us a notification of the mortality. So we know there's been a mortality or it's dropped off, and then we go to recover it.
When you do lose individuals, do you think, is it primarily like vehicle strikes?
It's a mix, and it depends by species.
Okay.
So I think one of the interesting outcomes of the first study was the really different sources of mortality between coyotes and foxes. And first of all, we didn't lose that many foxes. I think it was maybe a handful of them, 4 or 5, something like that in the first study.
We lost a handful of coyotes.
That's what I mean. Yeah, coyotes. And that was sort of a mix between cars, which are sort of a super predator in a way. They don't really care. They just take out wildlife. And I can't remember the other sources of mortality there, but the really shocking, I think, finding was that our red foxes were just, all of them were dying. I mean, I think how many even survived
to the end of the battery life of the collar?
Yeah.
So just to kind of break down the numbers, we had 3 that we think were killed by coyotes based on the evidence at the site. So that was like the number one cause where we could actually assign, like some of them we get to them too late to do a necropsy, which is basically an autopsy for an animal. So for the ones that we could assign a cause to, the most common one was possible coyote attacks. We had 1 get chased by a dog, which apparently stressed it to death, is kind of what we found. So there's 4 caused by other larger canids.
Yeah.
We had 1 that was a really mangy fox, so it ended up being euthanized by Minneapolis Animal Control. And then we had another that was a vehicle strike. And then actually kind of the most surprising one was we had 2 that drowned, which we really didn't expect drowning to be a significant contributor, but 1 drowned in a uncovered pool and another one drowned in a lake. We think maybe they were possibly chasing aquatic birds, so ducks, into these water bodies, and then couldn't get out of the pool or couldn't get out of the lake in those cases. So basically foxes have danger coming from all directions in these urban environments, so they have a pretty tough life out there.
Yeah.
I think like probably the most shocking thing to hear about that is, well, I'm disappointed but not surprised, is that like the human impact is so big on the lifespan of these animals.
It is. And in fact, one of the coyotes that we lost, it was actually hunted, but the reason, like many of our animals don't get hunted because we're, especially in the first study, we're studying primarily the urban area. But there was one animal that we'd actually collared on campus, and it was pretty cool. It had, sort of stayed around in the fairgrounds area and sort of roamed around campus and some of the nearby neighborhoods. And this would have been in the midst of COVID, so it was probably in 2020. Yeah, probably in 2020 is I'm guessing when that was. But I was teaching a class on animal movement and was incorporating some of the locations from this animal because it was local, and the students, you can see it. And then, this animal just, I was living in the Midway at the time, and it just went from up sort of north where campus is all the way down very close to my neighborhood, as if to say hi. I mean, it was bizarre, right? It was like within a few blocks of where I was living. It was just really weird. Stayed around there for like maybe a day, went back up north, and then just booked it for Wisconsin. And I think went 60 miles in like a span of...
As the crow flies.
Yeah,
So.
As the crow flies. Across, the St. Croix, everything. And in a span of not very long.
It was like
a few days, right?
Yeah, like a week probably.
Yeah. And then ultimately was harvested by somebody that was out hunting coyotes. And they were great. They, brought us back the collar, and we were able to download all the data and everything.
So you said there's a second iteration of the project. So
Correct.
There's the first one with the original one with the findings that we will post in the show notes. And then there's a secondary one that just started this year?
Yep,
Last year?
That's correct. Just started in July. And this is, so it's funded by the Environment and Natural Resources Trust Fund. And this funding was actually instituted as part of a constitutional amendment in Minnesota. And we take some of the, fractional portion of the proceeds from the lottery and actually put it towards natural resources in preservation and conservation management in the state. And anyways, the new version, we found all these really curious interactions. I mean, these animals are doing wild things, like in the midst of the human basically matrix, right? They're denning under people's decks, they're, places that you would have no idea there's a coyote. There's coyotes like having, sleeping in the woods just a few paces off of a jogging trail. We see all these kinds of interesting ways that these animals kind of find a way to make a living amongst us, right? And it made us wonder, one, there's these really strong interactions between coyotes and red foxes. We've already talked about these coyotes coming in. They kill a lot of our red foxes. They certainly will chase them away. There's a lot of that interaction amongst the species. And we were kind of wondering if there was kind of a human shield effect going on inside the cities, where the foxes might kind of retreat behind the human shield, and the coyotes might stay out in maybe the larger green spaces in the urban areas. And that was the way they kind of partitioned space. And we wondered if that changes across a gradient of urbanization. And so Geoff sort of folded this into his dissertation and started looking at ways that we could expand outward. And so right now we're expanding outwards towards St. Cloud. So we're going to try to incorporate St. Cloud as a smaller urban area, and then the sort of rural areas in between along the Mississippi corridor to try to get an idea of how the interaction between the space use patterns, the diets, and also the interactions between the species might change across that gradient.
Yeah, like I'm thinking about, it was during the winter when we had real snow, and I was biking from here to my house over in Lindale. So I took the Greenway, and I'm like, it was like nighttime, but not that late. And I just see this like flash of kind of brownish gray next to me, and it's like kind of running alongside me a little bit, and then looks over and then cuts off, like goes north. And I was like, I think that was a coyote. That was not a stray dog. Like, is that something that you found? Like, are they using the same trails that we're using?
Yeah. So coyotes, like a lot of animals, just when they're moving through the environment, they want to use the quickest way from point A to point B. A lot of the time, that's going to be our walking trails. They also use a lot of railroads. Those are other good linear features that they can follow to get in between green spaces they might want to get to. But one thing you said there, I think is kind of an important thing to highlight, is you said this was getting close to nighttime. What we see with a lot of our urban coyotes is they actually shift from what's kind of natural for coyotes. These are visual hunters, so it's beneficial for them to be active during the day. What we find in urban areas, so here, also in Chicago, also in LA, is these animals are kind of shifting their activity to be more nocturnal. So they're going to use these trails. They're going to use kind of trails along railroads as well. River corridors are good movement corridors for them. They're going to use these corridors, but the vast majority of their activity is going to be dusk, dawn, and then during the night. So they really kind of hunker down during the day when people are most active. And then when there's a little break in activity starting right around dusk, they kind of start to hit the streets. And really their kind of preferences for the landscape really kind of widen as soon as people go to bed. So that's when they'll start to move into those areas where we wouldn't necessarily expect to see a coyote.
So on the Twitter, there's probably like, I think it's your highest tweet of the map that has the color coding of different animals and their territories, and it's so distinct. I did not realize that there is almost zero overlap. They are right next to each other.
Animals, yeah.
So that was something that was surprising for me as just a curious human. But what did you all find either in the first iteration or what you're finding now? What are some surprising things?
So not necessarily surprising, but some of the most important findings, I think, or some of the findings that really stood out to us, were some of the strategies that coyotes display to kind of coexist with people. So James talked about that coyote that was within a few paces of a walking trail in Minneapolis. And the way that it did that is it was tucked into a little bit of brush right on the precipice of a really steep slope. So by selecting this area that really people aren't going to want to scramble up and down a cliff and kind of risk life and limb, by selecting those areas, they're really kind of effectively distancing themselves from people. So that coyote in particular would just nap away for hours at a time. That was like one of his favorite spots to sleep. And meanwhile, hundreds of people would walk by walking pets, and I would occasionally stop by to watch this coyote, and I would see like pets kind of pull at their leash to try to, like, they knew that the coyote was there, but I don't think I ever saw anybody notice the coyote, which is pretty astounding. So that's one strategy they use. Another really interesting strategy we found is that a lot of our urban coyotes tend to use wetlands as a major habitat type in which they can kind of rest undisturbed during the daytime. There are a couple reasons that we think wetlands are kind of especially important for coyotes. For one, we do spring and summer field work, figuring out what these animals are doing during kind of the most important season for them, which is when they're raising pups. So I would go out and document kind of clusters of GPS points we got from the tracking collars. And what I was finding is as soon as the pups are mobile enough to get out of the den, we find a kind of majority of the urban animals are kind of shuttling their pups into wetlands. And as somebody who had to walk into these wetlands and see what these environments were like, you can see why that would be a good strategy for them if they want to avoid people. I think this is a really important result because it shows the value of these habitats, not only for coyotes themselves, but for actually mitigating some of the conflict between people and coyotes during this really crucial time of the year for them. So without wetlands where they can safely keep their pups, we might see an elevated level of occurrences of these negative interactions between people and coyotes. So more escorting behavior where they're following dogs and making sure people walking their dogs are getting out of their territories and away from their pups. So we think this is really kind of a vital ecosystem service. Oh, another thing that sticks out about coyotes is there's so much variability in what these animals treat as a home range, how many other animals they're associating with, so how many members are there in their pack. So just to kind of highlight a pretty extreme example of this. So we have same age class females, so relatively old female coyotes. One would use like a 1/4 mile squared area. She did this for months. She didn't leave a 1/4 mile squared. Another female coyote we tracked, she would occasionally go down to St. Anthony Falls and then back all the way down the river corridor to Hidden Falls. So that's like Highland Park area of St. Paul, 6 miles in one night. So you have one animal that's moving back and forth. If it was going to go round trip, it would be 12 miles, and another one that never leaves a 1/4 mile squared. So just a crazy amount of variability in the strategies these animals are using in urban landscapes.
And on average, they're about roughly 9 square kilometers for a coyote, and I think red foxes are about the same. But the variation is really big. The standard deviation is like 6 square kilometers, so it's like plus or minus quite a large amount that incorporate all of our animals. I'll bring up one more kind of surprising result. Was one of the things that we were really interested in was trying to see if there was any difference amongst these animals in terms of the diseases they were exposed to, and also any exposure potentially to different heavy metals that might be in the environment, and also to see if these urban animals were consuming a lot of human food. And my thought initially was, yeah, they will be. And because, we throw away a lot of garbage, and the animals certainly get into it. What we found on that front was, I think, pretty interesting. In terms of heavy metals, there was maybe a handful of them, one of which was arsenic, but what I'm thinking about actually, cadmium was one, or some of the nickel. Yeah. And these were all positively associated with more animals that had more impervious surface within their home ranges. They tended to have higher levels of these metals or other substances in their hair. So we're measuring that from their hair. And I don't think, like the maximum level of arsenic that we measured wasn't something that would have been considered toxic by human standards, at least. If you look at the levels that are considered exposure to arsenic. They're lower than that. It's maybe I'm going to get the numbers wrong, 0.7, I think, parts per million, whereas 1 to 2 is considered exposure in humans. But the point is that there was this really very clear linear association between those contaminants and the amount of impervious surface. What I was interested in was the disease exposure, though. And we didn't have enough animals to really get an idea about the gradient, but just overall, these animals were exposed to parvovirus, they're exposed to canine distemper. I think all of them were exposed to parvovirus.
Yeah.
They had antibodies in their blood for that. It's something that we vaccinate our domestic pets for. Same with distemper, and still very high rates of distemper amongst these animals, which can be fatal for canids, especially their young. So that was kind of across the population. But then, you're also seeing high incidence of Lyme disease exposure. And so this is really indicating that there may be sentinels for some of these diseases that might interface with our pets as we're out and about in the landscape, or us in the case of Lyme disease. And, Geoff and I were talking earlier about avian influenza is still, this repeated problem that's coming through. We haven't detected that, or I don't know if we even tested for it last time because it wasn't as big a thing, but
we have some fox carcasses that we could test for avian influenza. Yeah,
because it's definitely causing, sort of wreaking havoc across lots of animal species right now.
I can go on to another kind of interesting effect of coyotes on foxes, which is what I'm primarily interested in my dissertation. So coyotes and foxes are kind of these natural enemies. They have like similar habitat needs. They eat a lot of the same things, and since coyotes are larger, they kind of have this top-down effect. They want to displace foxes wherever they can and kill them in some cases. So like I said, we documented 3 of those killings. And I guess the interesting thing we found was when we do these analyses looking at which habitat types are most important to these animals, one of the things we found was, so coyote territory is almost invariably centered around green spaces. They would include these commercial areas, these residential areas, but primarily they're centered around these green spaces. Whereas foxes, we found almost across the board, they were centering their territories in residential areas. So they're really using neighborhoods as places where they can exist kind of apart from coyotes. So even though coyote territories include residential spaces, the time that they spend in those residential spaces is actually much lower. And that foxes can kind of leverage that and reduce their risk of exposure to these negative interactions with coyotes. And this is actually, there's a pretty direct example of the benefits that foxes kind of receive from being in these neighborhoods going on right now. So 58% of the fox dens that we've documented over the course of the project have been either under somebody's deck, under somebody's shed, or generally under another human structure in a residential area. And meanwhile, coyotes, they're going to have all of the dens we documented were in green spaces. So we actually had a couple of examples of why they might be choosing to have dens in these locations. So we got sent 2 videos from residents where the video kind of starts off with them hearing a fox barking, and then moves on to them investigating what's going on. And in one of the cases, a coyote is at somebody's deck trying to get under their deck where there's a den full of fox kits. And this fox was actually, it had its back to the person, and so clearly was more afraid of the coyote than it was of the person, and was barking at the coyote. The person came out, chased away the coyotes, might have saved those kits' lives. So we had another one get sent to us, which was a similar scenario. The person knocked on the window to scare the coyote away, but again, it was a coyote trying to get at a den. So by associating with people, you see this pretty direct shielding effect, especially during the spring, that these animals can kind of leverage to coexist with both people and coyotes in this landscape.
Why don't you talk about how you're going to test that hypothesis and how it changes?
Oh, yeah.
This is really cool.
Yeah, so one interesting method for getting at kind of how animals perceive fear or perceive risk in their environment is through what's called audio playback experiments. So in this case, what we're going to be doing is we have these trail cameras, so typical wildlife trail cameras that we had to kind of hack into, and then we hooked those up to a speaker system. And what happens is when those cameras are triggered, the speaker system will play back a sound that we want to gauge an animal's response to. So we're baiting in these coyotes and foxes, and what we're doing for foxes is we're playing back audio of human voice and audio of coyote vocalizations, and we'll get kind of a ranked response of do they fear people more or coyotes more in this environment. So we can get at kind of the driver of maybe some of this landscape partitioning that we're seeing. So is that driven by actual foxes fearing coyotes, or is that driven instead by something we're not measuring? Like, do foxes just like the number of rabbits they find in neighborhoods? For coyotes, we're also doing the same set of experiments, except we're primarily focusing on human voice and seeing how coyotes' responses to human voice, how that changes across an urbanization gradient. So we can see, do they fear people a lot more in rural areas, which is what I would suspect because they're hunted. So by getting kind of that full picture of who fears who where on the landscape, we can kind of get at what's driving these movement patterns that we're seeing.
So we're big audio nerds, so I do have to ask, what kinds of things are the human voice saying?
So to kind of control for variability, we have to have something pretty standardized. So we didn't want it to sound too aggressive or too quiet, too passive. We wanted it to also be somewhat similar to the vocal signature of the coyote playback that we're doing, so we don't get some like jump scare effect in there. Actually, the treatment that we're using is just like a pretty loud playback of audiobooks being read. So we went to an open source audiobook library and just pulled a lot of boring clips of people talking about Germanic literature and stuff.
Oh, that's wonderful.
So if you're out walking in the woods and you start hearing a podcast, you'll know it's us.
And it's not the podcast in my ears. It's a wild podcast. That's so good. I guess, yeah, so Streets of Men is enjoyed by folks all over the state, or at least we hope. That is exciting that you all are doing stuff in the St. Cloud area. That is audience that we don't have a huge number for yet, but maybe we will now. So what are things for Minnesotans outside of the Twin Cities should know about their coyote neighbors? Are you already noticing big differences between the urban, suburban, and rural coyotes, or is that more of findings that we'll see in the future?
I'd say it's probably going to be findings we'll see in the future. I mean, we're just into the first few months of having most of these animals on the air. What I think people should just generally think about with respect to coyotes especially is that these animals are pretty liberally hunted, I would say, in rural areas. And that's the regulation that's on them at the state level. But I would say, if these animals are sort of showing aggressive behaviors or taking livestock, obviously this is a really good reason to remove those animals with some kind of lethal control. But I'd really encourage people to think about them as being a really important part of the ecosystem, because really these animals are out there. They're specializing on small mammals that could carry things like Lyme disease or other things that might affect us as humans. And they're an important part of that ecosystem. So I would say just keep that in mind. And generally, they tend to be pretty innocuous animals.
Yeah. And just to kind of piggyback off of that, a lot of the lethal control efforts for coyotes are just futile efforts.
In terms of overall control.
Control. Yeah. Like, it might fix a issue you're having temporarily, but coyotes are one of the most resilient animals the animal kingdom. So the U.S. government had bounties on coyotes throughout much of the 20th century. And during that time, coyotes expanded from the prairie states and the desert Southwest to the eastern seaboard, north to Alaska, south to the Panama Canal. They're now across the Panama Canal, and this is all in the face of our best efforts to keep them from doing any of that. So I think coexistence is really the key here, finding out how to coexist with these behaviorally complex animals that they're hard to understand, which makes them hard to manage. And I would just encourage people to try to find long-term solutions rather than temporary solutions in management of these animals.
Right. And I think like for urbanites especially, this is like everyone who has a dog, I'm like, please keep your dog on a leash. The last thing you want to do is have your dog run off the trail and go visit a sleeping coyote.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it's true. I mean, and also to kind of understand what are the behaviors of these animals that are living amongst us. You know, a friend of mine that used to live right down in this area used to run along the Mississippi River, and he called me up one day. He's like, James, I was out on a run today and with my dog, and this coyote zipped up and was like right behind us. And this is that escorting behavior that Geoff was talking about. And he was really freaked out by it. I mean, legitimately, right? Because they seem very big, even if they're, only about 30 pounds or so. But they're a substantial animal, and they're, showing aggressive behavior, probably because they're defending their den site. But the point is that realize that they're not really out there to get you. They're just trying to manage their own space. And you just want to try to keep your distance and yell at them, shake something at them to try to get them away. But just realize that you can use some of these mitigation measures to keep them away from you. I think one of the popular ones that folks suggest is they call it the garbage bag method, where people just take a black trash bag and just like opening it and like flacking it at coyotes. Is something you can just carry in your pocket. It's apparently very effective at scaring off coyotes. Another one would be an umbrella. You're carrying a small umbrella that would provide a physical disruption. Also opening and closing it. This sort of flapping notion is very disruptive and unusual for those animals. It can scare them away. So there's lots of things you can do to kind of get animals away from you if they're kind of causing
throwing
problems.
Innocuous things is also a good move. Not many things in the animal kingdom can throw things.
Projectiles.
So that is pretty unsettling for a lot of animals. So that's a good move too. Just to add some context to James's story about the guy running along the Mississippi Parkway. So I followed up on that location where that incident happened. And about 20 yards off of that trail, there was a den, and later we documented pups emerging from that den.
So it was really useful sighting, actually.
Yeah, so that just goes to show, like, if you can understand the way that these animals are interpreting this landscape, they have a lot at stake when they have these young, vulnerable pups in these dens. So if you see a coyote come after you like that, you probably know that you're in an area where they're being defensive around a den, and kind of staying away from those areas and kind of keeping the stress level low for these animals while they're in this really vulnerable time period is pretty crucial for trying to coexist with them in urban landscapes.
Yeah. So avoidance. My personal favorite is the hazing. What a great term for that. That was one of my questions, is actually like, what are your favorite hazing methods if you have a coyote that's a little too curious? I think this is more of a thing in like suburban and rural. I dog sit out in Victoria all the time in the morning. We'll see this one coyote and I just give a big like and just kind of like yell some gibberish. But do you think the trash bag is your favorite?
That's it's been highly recommended by folks that study hazing methods for coyotes. I mean, this is one of those things you have to use your best judgment, right? That these animals also can get rabies, so there's acting very strange, especially during the day. You see other signs that it's unwell. You really want to be careful around these animals and, use good judgment to not get close.
Right. Like a car horn would not do anything in the Twin Cities.
Probably not.
Because that's a very common sound.
And some folks suggest things like whistles, other auditory things, and they can work, but having that physical thing of like the black trash bag or the umbrella, because it adds in the visual and the sound, I think that's, and also the fact that it's very unusual, tends to be pretty effective. And I think, Geoff, you had some suggestions of maybe a website folks could go to for hazing methods.
The Humane Society of America publishes hazing methods for coyotes, and they'll give you pretty good guidance on what tactics to use in what scenarios. So I would recommend checking that out if you're curious about hazing methods.
Yeah, because I think what you just said is really important to keep in mind. these animals are among us.
Right.
And you don't want to haze an animal that's not causing a problem. Because if an animal, these animals have to make a living. And so if you see a coyote in a park running across, running through the forest, don't haze it.
Right.
If it's, approaching you and seems aggressive, that's a good time to do that. And so it's trying to decide when and where and try to decode what these animals are doing before you try to push it somewhere else.
Right. Like avoidance is so much easier. I can just take a different path or
That's right.
Right.
really swing around.
And to that point, I mean, like during the denning season, hazing is going to be really ineffective, probably quite disruptive to these animals. And so that's a time of the year when if people just know, like, okay, this sort of like late spring, early summer sort of period of time, if I see coyotes out, this is probably what's going on. I just have to be aware and give them space. And I think that if that's probably a better move than trying to stress them out.
Right. And then let's see. So we love citizen science here at Streets MN, and I was looking on your website, there's a link to report sightings. Can you talk about a little bit of that? Of like you said, you had a sighting, and then later you found out that there was a den really close to a trail. And has citizen science really been helpful?
It's been vital.
Yeah,
right?
A huge amount of our intel on the animals that we include in our study comes from people just telling us where they've seen an animal. So I can't get out and track animals everywhere in the metro. That's just a physical impossibility. So having people report, especially foxes in neighborhoods, is pretty vital to being able to track any of those foxes, because we can't walk through people's private property and figure out where there's fox tracks or fox scat, which is our method we use to find animals in public areas. So people can go to our website. We have a way to directly report sightings through our website. We also have an iNaturalist project where people can go on iNaturalist. We actually have it so that most of the coyote and fox observations that are just casually reported by people in the metro who don't even know about the project get funneled to our project anyways. But a lot of people go to our iNaturalist project and directly report sightings there as well.
Yeah, and that a naturalist is really interesting because we do get a lot of data from there. And one time for a course I was running, I was kind of curious how well those documentations would identify where coyotes were or where they spent their time. And so I basically did what we call a resource selection function. It basically decides, what proportion of the points that you have of these sightings are in landscape characteristics that are more or less common. And so basically you predict the probability of observing a coyote. It's essentially what these models are for. And so I did that based on all the data we had from iNaturalist. And then I also built a similar model using the actual locations of coyotes that we had collared. And the outcome was almost completely inverted, right? That they were using where they spent most of their time was not the place people were reporting them. And so, and this goes back to what Geoff was talking about earlier, is that they're actually really good at avoiding humans. And the places that people tend to go, yeah, they'll run into them occasionally, but there's a lot more coyotes out there than you expect.
Yeah, I always tell people if they've been outside in a Minneapolis green space, they've probably been within 30 yards of coyote and didn't know it. So yeah, they're out there.
I think about like biking through Crosby Farm.
Oh yeah.
There's probably a ton. I think what else?
Oh, I'm going to follow up and think, I forgot to mention this earlier, but this is related to their diet. This is one of the things that was surprising to me, was I was really expecting these animals to have a strong human food signature. And the way we measure that is using, it's called stable isotope analysis. It looks at delta 13C carbon and delta 15N for nitrogen. And those are basically ways of looking at the composition of food, because different plant and animal structures sort of have different levels of these isotopes. One of the things that really pops out is corn. So that's something that has a very high carbon, delta 13C carbon value. And so it really shows if you're eating a lot of corn. You can do it with your own hair. You clip your hair and send it in, you'll see a high corn signature probably. Because we just put corn syrup in everything. There's, obviously corn in many of the foods we eat just as a grain. And anyways, most animals that tend to eat on human food have that corn signature. we only had 2 or 3 animals that really showed that they were eating a fairly high amount of what we think is human food. And most of them were really eating a natural diet as far as we could tell. And so that means that these animals are living amongst us, but they're still eating a fairly natural diet, which was to me very surprising. Maybe it shouldn't be given the number of rabbits and squirrels I see in my yard, but there's plenty of food out there for them that they don't have to come in and eat our garbage. But that's just something that I was kind of surprised about.
Would you say that kind of shows off the strength of the ecosystem that we have, that they don't have to rely on going through my compost bin or anything?
For sure. I think that if you look at a map of the Twin Cities, it's a really cool city, I think, from an environmental standpoint, in the sense that you've got these rivers running through with green spaces, you've got lakes dotted all over the place, lots of parks and other natural areas. So yeah, I think that is a sign that we have a city that is well integrated with some of the natural areas around it. And from a citizen science perspective, or just really a human experience, one of the reasons I'm very curious in urban wildlife is, trying to understand this and excite people about this, that they don't have to go to the wilderness to see wild things. Like, you can go in your own backyard, you can go in the park that's right around the corner, and if you sit and watch and are quiet and pay attention, you can see some things that will just blow your mind. And I think, to me, that is the most exciting part of this, is really just talking with people and getting them to realize there's a predator in my backyard, and yeah, there is, and it's really cool. So that's pretty exciting to me. And as we understand how these animals move through our landscape, I think we learn a lot about sort of how they're adapting to the spaces that we build, and kind of realizing that at the end of the day, we are wildlife. We're just wildlife that makes roads and cars and houses. And, so we're all kind of interacting together. And so trying to understand those systems and how those other species respond to us is really critical. And, we're also in the process of starting a project to look at how deer move through these systems as well. And what diseases do they pick up along the way, which can also impact us, SARS-CoV-2 being one of the dominant ones.
Yeah, I feel like being out in these spaces trying to catch these animals, you get a really good idea of how much wildlife actually lives right in the urban core. So if I were to list the species that I've seen while being able to look up and see the Minneapolis skyline, I've seen otters, beavers, like all 3 of the canids that we've studied. Actually, all 3 species we've documented within a half mile of US Bank Stadium. So that shows you how urban these animals are. They're right here in the city.
There are fishers that are not so far away that are, coming through this area as well.
Yeah, we have, along the river corridor, mountain lions move through. So we not only have these animals able to move through along these green space corridors, but we actually have these resident animals here within the city, which is really cool to be able to look up and see the juxtaposition between these human-built landscapes and wildlife actually adapting to those landscapes.
And to be clear about the mountain lions, they're not residents in here. They're dispersing from probably the Dakotas.
Yeah, like when we had that mountain lion that came through.
Exactly.
I think some people were scared right away, and I was like, oh, they've always been here. There's probably one in Afton. They're all over, or they're passing through. It's fine. They're not going to get you. They're not going to get your dog. You're going to be okay. Just to kind of give a little bit of a sneak peek. This is part 1 that I'm probably going to do 4 parts of different human wildlife in urban spaces. So I think we're thinking deer, bears, and raptors, I think was the other one. Big birds.
Not that big bird.
not that big bird. So stay tuned for that. Or if you want to be involved, if you are interested in deer, I think, is it U of M and then also Bemidji?
Yep, Bemidji is, they're just started, I think, last winter. They started looking at how deer are responding to an urban bow hunt. Mm-mm. And so that's a pretty interesting project. In fact, one of our former undergrads is working up there. So the project that we have here going, this is primarily focused on looking at how deers get COVID and transmit it amongst themselves, and they're still carrying COVID in their population, probably from reinfection from humans, which is like one of those things you wouldn't know that until you look. But we have deer collared up at Elm Creek, Carver Park, and down in Shakopee. And so we're working with a bunch of collaborators on that project to kind of understand both how these animals move in these urban, suburban areas, and ultimately we're going to be looking at how they spread across or move across the Twin Cities metro area.
Those were all of my questions. I'm so excited that we got through all of them. I was really excited. Thank you both so much for coming to the home studio, and
it's a good excuse to get a bike ride across town in. So yeah. I got a little exercise.
This is something I've been nerding out for. I mean, every time we go camping, I'm like, Ian, the coyotes. Ian, do you hear them? They're right there.
Oh my, yeah. I mean, the number of times that people have called me, or that some of my undergrads will be like, James, they'll send me a recording via email and be like, listen to this, and it's like just the coyotes yipping outside their window. It's just like, yeah, they're out and about. Yeah, well, thanks for having us. We really appreciate it.
Oh, thank you.
Thanks for joining us for this episode of the Streets.mn podcast. The show is released under a Creative Commons Attribution, Non-Commercial, Non-Derivative license, so feel free to republish the episode as long as you are not altering it and you're not profiting from it. The music in this episode is by Eric Brandt and the Urban Hillbilly Quartet. This episode was produced by Stina Neel, edited by Parker Seaman, aka Strongthany, transcribed by Tom Fendt and Jeremy Winter, and hosted by me, Ian R. Buck. We're always looking to feature new voices on the Streets.mn podcast, so if you have ideas for future episodes, drop us a line at podcast@streets.mn. Streets.mn is a community blog and podcast and relies on contributions from audience members like you. If you can make a one-time or recurring donation, you can find more information about doing so at streets.mn/donate. Find other listeners and discuss this episode on your favorite social media platform using the hashtag StreetsMNPodcast. Until next time, take care.